The air reeked of smoke and blood, the earth still trembling from the violence that had swept across it. The Apache warrior lay half-buried in dust, his dark eyes staring up at a sky that seemed too blue, too peaceful for the carnage that surrounded him. He had been strong once, proud, a fierce defender of his people's way of life. Now he was broken, not merely wounded, but shattered in a way no warrior should ever be. The ambush had come swiftly, without warning. Rifles cracked, horses screamed, and men fell where they stood. He had fought with all the fury his heart could summon, but in the chaos, the blast that ripped through his legs ended more than just his fight. It ended his place among his people. In Apache tradition, a warrior's strength was his worth, and now both his legs were gone, torn away. In the battle's fire, he remembered the burning agony as his brothers lifted him, carried him a short distance, and then laid him beneath the shade of a lone mesquite tree. Their faces had been hard, not unkind, but resigned. Death was near, and to waste time and effort on a body that could no longer ride, hunt, or fight was unthinkable. In the code of survival, the wounded who could not walk were left behind to meet their spirits. They left him food enough for a day, a gourd of water, and a knife to fight off coyotes, or to end his own suffering. Then they rode on, their silhouettes swallowed by dust and distance. The warrior did not curse them. He understood. He would have done the same. But understanding did little to soften the weight of despair pressing against his chest. Alone in the wilderness, crippled and bleeding, he waited for death to claim him. Time slipped strangely in his solitude. Days and nights blended, marked only by pain and thirst. The sun baked him, the cold nights bit into his flesh. Coyotes howled, circling closer with each passing evening. He gripped his knife, ready for the end, but even raising his arm drained the little strength left within him. At moments, he prayed to the spirits, asking them to let him go swiftly. At others, he raged against the silence, against the injustice of being left to rot like carrion. Yet something within him clung stubbornly to life. Even when every breath was agony, he refused to close his eyes for the last time. Perhaps it was pride, perhaps the instinct of a warrior who had never bowed to an enemy, even when beaten. Or perhaps it was something deeper, some faint whisper, that his story was not yet finished. On the fourth day, when the sun rose cruel and bright, his world changed. Through the haze of fever and exhaustion, he heard movement, not the soft tread of coyotes, not the thunder of horses, but something gentler. He opened his eyes and saw a figure silhouetted against the dawn. A woman, pale-skinned, her hair tucked beneath a bonnet, her arms cradling a basket of herbs. At first he thought she was a vision, a spirit come to mock him. But when she gasped at the sight of him, when she dropped to her knees beside his mangled body, he realized she was flesh and blood. Her eyes widened with horror and pity, but also with something he had not seen in many days: concern. The Apache warrior, left to die by his own, stared up at this white woman, an outsider, someone he might once have called an enemy. And in that instant, though he did not yet know it, the course of his life shifted forever. The woman had not intended to find anyone that day. Her life on the edge of the frontier was hard, demanding every ounce of strength just to keep from starving. Since her husband's death the previous winter, she had lived alone in a modest cabin, scraping by on what she could forage, trade, or grow. Each morning, she walked farther into the wilderness, gathering herbs and roots for food and medicine. She had learned to move quietly, wary of snakes, wolves, and the possibility of raiders. That morning, the land was still. The prairie grass whispered in the breeze, and the distant cry of a hawk carried across the sky. She bent low, plucking wild onions near a rocky slope, when a sound reached her, faint, almost hidden beneath the sighing wind. At first, she thought it the growl of an animal. But as she paused, listening, the sound came again, a rasping breath hoarse and weak, like someone clinging to life. Caution stiffened her spine. She lifted her head, scanning the brush. A wagon accident, perhaps? A wounded settler? Or worse, a trap set by desperate men who knew a woman alone was easy prey? Her hand tightened on the knife at her belt as she crept toward the sound. The sight that met her eyes froze her in place. Beneath a twisted mesquite tree lay a man. No, not just a man, but an Apache. His skin was bronzed by the sun, his long, black hair matted with blood and dust. His bare chest rose and fell shallowly, and where his legs should have been were bandaged stumps, raw and horrifying. Flies buzzed around him, and the earth was stained with the dark shadow of dried blood. Her first instinct was fear. Every tale she had heard in the settlement painted Apaches as ruthless, merciless warriors who burned homes and took scalps. Her husband had spoken of them often, with both respect and dread. And now, here was one of those very men, broken and helpless before her. She could have walked away. She could have turned back, pretended she had seen nothing, left him to die as fate seemed to intend. The thought crossed her mind in a rush, her heart hammering with the weight of the decision. Helping him could bring danger. If his people returned, they might see her aid as meddling. If the settlers learned, they might accuse her of treachery. And yet, she looked closer. His lips were cracked, his skin burning with fever. His dark eyes opened slightly, and in them she saw not the fierce fire of a warrior, but the quiet desperation of a man who had been left behind. He did not reach for his knife. He did not snarl or threaten. He simply looked at her, the faintest flicker of shame and plea mixed in that gaze. Something within her. Perhaps the memory of her husband's final days, when she had watched helplessly as fever carried him away, stirred with compassion. She remembered the loneliness of grief, the bitterness of being left with no one. She could not walk away from this man, enemy or not. To abandon him would be to abandon a part of her own humanity. Kneeling beside him, she placed her basket down and pulled out her water gourd. His lips trembled when she lifted his head and poured a trickle between them. He drank greedily, then coughed, his chest rattling with the effort. She tore strips from her apron to wipe the blood and flies away, her hands steady despite the pounding of her heart. The Apache tried to speak, but only a broken whisper escaped. She did not understand his words, but she understood his struggle. "Hush," she murmured softly, though she knew he could not comprehend her tongue. "Save your strength." As she worked, she felt the enormity of her choice settle over her. She could not leave him now. Not after touching him, not after seeing the raw human pain behind the label of enemy. She would have to carry him somehow, nurse him, and pray that in helping him, she had not sealed her own doom. When the sun dipped low, she gathered her strength, slid her arms beneath his shoulders, and with gritted teeth began dragging him inch by inch toward the path that led to her cabin. Every step was slow, backbreaking, but she did not falter. She had chosen life, his, and perhaps in some strange way, her own. And so, a white widow and a crippled Apache warrior began a story neither of them had expected, one born not of battle, but of compassion in the wilderness. The cabin was little more than a single-room shelter of rough-hewn logs, patched with mud and straw to keep out the worst of the wind. It had been built by her husband before death claimed him, and though it was far from comfortable, it was enough to keep her alive through the bitter winter. Now it would serve as a refuge for two, though one of them had not yet decided if he wanted to live at all. When she finally dragged the Apache warrior inside, her arms quivered with exhaustion. He was heavier than he looked, the muscle in his broad shoulders still firm despite his condition. She laid him on the rough bed of straw and blankets, and for a long moment simply leaned against the wall, panting, staring at the broken man she had taken into her home. The first night was a test of will. His fever rose high and he thrashed in the bed, muttering words in a tongue she could not understand. She cooled his skin with damp cloths, whispered soothingly, though he could not hear her, and forced sips of water past his cracked lips. Each time he turned his face away, she pressed the gourd back insistently. She had seen death's shadow before, and she would not surrender him to it without a fight. By dawn, his breathing eased, though his body was weak as a child's. When his eyes opened and found her sitting nearby, he looked at her with suspicion. He tried to push the cup of broth she held away, shaking his head with grim finality. She understood, though no words passed between them. He wanted to die. But she would not allow it. Her husband had slipped through her fingers, his life ebbing away despite her desperate prayers. She would not fail again, not when this man had been placed in her path as if by providence. Narrowing her eyes, she set her jaw and lifted the spoon to his lips. "Eat," she commanded softly. He did not know the word, but he understood the intent. When he resisted, she surprised herself by snapping, "Don't be foolish." There was steel in her tone, the same steel that had carried her through loneliness, through hunger, through nights when coyotes circled her cabin and despair pressed in like a suffocating fog. The warrior blinked at her, startled by her fierceness, and after a long silence, parted his lips to accept the broth. It was a small victory, but one that filled her with a quiet, trembling relief. The days that followed were slow, hard, and uncertain. She tended his wounds with poultices made from wild plants, changing the wrappings when blood seeped through. She ground herbs for tea to fight infection. Every task took longer with him in the cabin, fetching water, chopping wood, cooking, yet strangely, she did not feel more burdened. For the first time in months, she was not entirely alone. At first, he rarely spoke, watching her with dark, unreadable eyes. When she entered the room, his gaze followed her, not in threat, but in quiet study. Sometimes he muttered words she could not comprehend, frustration tightening his jaw. She wondered if he cursed her for keeping him alive. But little by little, a change came. He began to drink without protest. He accepted the food she brought him. And one morning, when she returned from the creek, she found him trying to lift himself upright on the bed, his strong arms trembling with effort. Though the attempt ended with him collapsing back, his eyes burned with something new, defiance, the spark of a man who had not yet surrendered to the grave. At night, when the coyotes howled outside and the fire crackled low, she sometimes wondered what madness had possessed her to save him. An Apache in her home, a man marked as an enemy by her own people. And yet, when she saw him struggle against despair, she felt something stir inside her. Not love, not yet, but a recognition. They were both survivors, both scarred, both left, behind by those they had once depended on. And so, the first fragile days of survival passed. He was no longer merely a wounded enemy in her care. He was becoming something else, a presence that filled the silence, a reminder that perhaps, even in brokenness, life could go on. The days turned into weeks, and with every passing sunrise, the warrior's body grew a little stronger. His wounds began to knit, though the scars on the stumps of his legs would forever mark him as different, broken in the eyes of his people. His upper body, however, remained powerful. His shoulders and arms thickened again as he forced himself to move, to lift, to crawl across the floor of the cabin rather than remain lying helpless. But his spirit did not heal so quickly. Every mouthful of food she offered was a reminder of his helplessness. Every time she brought water to his lips, it cut into his pride like a knife. In Apache tradition, a warrior was measured by his strength, his ability to hunt, to fight, to ride. Without legs, what was he? Nothing but a burden, a shadow of the man he once had been. He hated the pity he thought he saw in her eyes. When she cleaned his wounds, he turned his face away. When she spoke to him in her soft, gentle voice, He clenched his jaw, refusing to answer. Even when he could see that she meant no insult, the shame burned hot inside him. More than once, he refused her food. He pressed his lips tight, glaring at her as if daring her to force him. The first time, she tried coaxing. The second time, she grew angry, slamming the bowl down on the table with a force that startled them both. "If you want to die, then die," she snapped, her voice trembling with frustration. "But don't you dare waste what I've given to keep you alive." He did not understand every word, but her tone carried meaning enough. Her cheeks flushed with heat, her hands trembling, she turned away to stir the fire. And for the first time, he looked at her not with resentment but with curiosity. She was not afraid of him. She did not treat him as a cripple, nor as an enemy. She treated him as though his life mattered, not because he was a warrior, not because he had power, but simply because he was human. It unsettled him. The struggle between pride and gratitude gnawed at him in every moment. Pride told him he was no longer worthy to live. Gratitude whispered that without her, he would already be food for coyotes. He resented her strength even as he admired it. She chopped wood, hauled water, cooked meals, and tended to him with tireless determination. Each night she collapsed by the fire, weary but uncomplaining. He had seen warriors weaker than her. One evening, as dusk settled and the fire painted her face in warm light, he watched her mend a tear in her dress with careful stitches. His chest ached, not with pain, but with the weight of his conflicted heart. He wanted to thank her, yet the words would not come. His tongue, trained for commands and battle cries, stumbled when faced with something as fragile as gratitude. Instead, he tried to offer action. The next day, he dragged himself outside and began chopping vegetables for stew with clumsy, shaking hands. She found him there, sweat beading his brow, and for the first time since she had saved him, a smile flickered across her lips. She said, "Something." He could not understand the words, but her voice carried warmth, approval. That night, when she placed a bowl before him, he ate without resistance. Slowly, the silence between them softened. She began to teach him simple English, words, water, food, fire. In return, he spoke Apache names for the same things. They laughed at each other's awkward accents, the first laughter that had ever passed between them. But even with this fragile bridge of understanding, his pride was never fully silent. At times he still turned his face to the wall, muttering, in bitterness. At others, he clenched his fists, raging at the unfairness of being trapped in a body that could no longer run, ride, or fight. And yet, every time despair threatened to swallow him, he saw her face, stern, steady, unwilling to give up on him. And though he could not yet admit it, gratitude was taking root in his heart, growing stronger than the pride that sought to smother it. The battle between pride and gratitude raged on. But for the first time since the battlefield had stolen his legs, the warrior began to feel that perhaps he was not entirely lost. By late spring, the warrior's strength had returned, not to his legs, for they were gone forever, but to his arms, chest, and spirit. No longer content to lie idle while she carried the burdens of survival alone, he forced himself to act. Crawling across the floor, pulling himself with powerful arms, he began to test the limits of what he could still do. Pride, which once threatened to consume him, now drove him to prove that his worth had not been lost with his legs. It began with small tasks. He chopped vegetables, tended the fire, and cleaned tools with care. She never asked him to do these things, yet she never stopped him either. In her silence, he sensed respect. She understood he did not want charity. He wanted purpose. Soon his eyes fell on the cabin itself. Built by her husband's hands, it was weathered and failing. Gaps in the walls let in drafts, and the roof sagged under years of storms. She had patched it alone as best she could, but a woman's hands, however strong, could not match the craft of one who had spent a life in labor and survival. One morning, he gestured to the broken roof beams. "Bad," he said in halting English, frowning. Then, in Apache, he added words she could not understand, pointing from the logs outside to the cabin above. His meaning, however, was clear. She arched a brow, amused but wary. "You want to fix it?" He nodded, determination blazing in his eyes. The work began at once. Using a crude wooden sled he carved himself, he dragged logs from the nearby woods, pulling them inch by inch with raw strength. She tried to stop him at first, worried the effort would reopen his wounds, but he waved her off with a sharp grunt. Sweat poured down his body, muscles straining, but he welcomed the pain. It was proof he was alive. She joined him, cutting saplings, carrying branches, weaving grasses for insulation. At first they worked in silence, but gradually small exchanges passed between them. Gestures, laughter at clumsy mistakes, the patient repetition of words in both English and Apache. Together, they became a team. The cabin slowly transformed. He reinforced the roof with new beams, guided her in creating stronger supports for the walls, and even crafted a small smoke hole to let fire breathe without filling the air with choking haze. With his warrior's skill, he shaped tools from stone and wood, showing her how to use sinew as cord and clay as mortar. One evening, as the sun painted the horizon in red and gold, they stood, he sitting tall on the sled he had built, she wiping sweat from her brow, and admired their work. The cabin was sturdier now, not just a shelter but a home remade by their shared effort. That night, for the first time, she did not feel the cabin belonged only to her late husband's memory. It was something new, something built by both their hands. She realized with a quiet pang of surprise that she no longer thought of him only as the Apache she had saved. He was her companion in survival, her partner in labor. For him, the cabin became more than wood and earth. It was proof that he was not useless, not a broken shell waiting for death. His people had abandoned him to the wilderness, but here he had built again, contributed again, lived again. In those long days of shared sweat and silent companionship, a bond began to grow, not yet spoken, not yet fully understood, but as steady as the beams of the shelter they had raised together. The cabin no longer felt like a tomb of silence. With each passing day, sounds filled it, the scrape of tools, the crackle of the fire, the murmur of words in two different tongues. At first, their communication had been only gestures, pointing, nodding, miming actions. But slowly, a fragile bridge of language began to stretch between them. She taught him English words in patient tones, pointing to simple things: water, bread, fire. He repeated them, his deep voice stumbling over the unfamiliar syllables. In return, he spoke Apache words, sharp and musical. Tu for water, Daka for fire, she for me. She laughed at her clumsy attempts, but he never mocked her. When she erred, he gently corrected, shaking his head with a quiet smile. At night, the lessons continued in the glow of the fire. He would tap his chest and say, "She," then point to her. She would answer, "Me," tapping her own chest. They repeated it, back and forth, until their laughter broke through the old walls of grief and suspicion. The first time he laughed, truly laughed, it startled her. His voice had always been heavy, edged with bitterness or silence, but now it rolled out, deep and warm, filling the cabin like a blessing. She felt her heart catch in her chest at the sound, as though life itself had found its way back into him. For him, these exchanges were more than words. They were a lifeline. Where once he had been trapped in his solitude, locked away by language and shame, now he found a way to reach her. Even simple exchanges gave him dignity. He could ask for water, thank her for food, teach her to say the names of the stars. He was no longer a mute shadow in her home, but language was not only spoken. Much was said through hands, eyes, and silence. When he lifted a beam for the roof and sweat streamed down his face, she wordlessly offered him a cloth. When she stumbled carrying a heavy bucket, he reached out instinctively, steadying it with his powerful arms. When she grew weary at night, her shoulders sagging with the day's weight, he took tools from her hands and finished the task himself. No words were needed. Their hearts spoke through these quiet offerings. Still, there were moments of tension. Pride often made him withdraw, refusing help when he needed it most. Once, when he fell trying to drag himself across the yard, he snarled in frustration as she rushed to his side. She ignored his anger, lifting him with her slight but determined frame, and when his fury subsided, he managed a single word in English. "Thanks." It was rough, grudging, but genuine. That night she repeated the Apache word for thanks. "Ahehe." He corrected her gently, then again, until she got it right. She grinned, proud of herself. He stared at her for a long moment afterward, something unreadable flickering in his eyes. Gratitude, yes, but also something softer, something that scared him more than the memory of battle. Slowly, their evenings became something he looked forward to. She would sew or mend by the firelight while he carved wood with his knife, shaping small tools and ornaments. Sometimes he carved figures, animals, birds, even the rough form of a horse, and placed them on the shelf. She admired them, her eyes shining, and he found pride in her admiration. Through language, hands, and shared silence, they built more than survival. They built trust. The fear that had once stood between them faded, replaced by something deeper, something unnamed. Neither dared to speak it aloud. Not yet. But in every shared glance, every exchanged word, every quiet act of care, a new language was forming, the language of hearts learning to beat together. By midsummer, the Apache warrior was no longer the half-dead man she had dragged in from under the mesquite tree. His wounds had healed into scars, his body hardened with strength born of determination. Though his legs were gone, his arms had grown powerful enough to lift, carry, and craft. He had remade himself in a new image, not the horse-mounted warrior of his past, but a man who could still shape, protect, and provide. His first true act of creation came from wood. With his knife and patience, he began carving supports, crude but sturdy crutches from branches and sinew bindings. The first attempts were clumsy. He fell often, once so hard that she rushed to him, certain he had broken bone. But he only laughed, shaking his head, refusing to be pitied. Time after time he tried again until finally he stood upright, balanced on the wooden supports. Though sweat poured down his brow and his breath came harsh, his eyes shone with triumph. She clapped her hands in delight, unable to contain her pride in him. "You did it!" she exclaimed, though he understood only her tone, not her words. Still, her joy mirrored his own, and for the first time, he allowed himself to feel not only gratitude, but hope. But his transformation was not only physical. The warrior who once longed for death now began to find purpose. He could no longer hunt deer on horseback, yet he taught her to set snares for rabbits, to track prints in the dirt, to read the movement of birds for signs of predators. She marveled at his knowledge, for though she had lived on the frontier, for years, she had only scratched the surface of the land's secrets. With his guidance, their meals grew more plentiful, their lives more secure. He also took to carving tools, handles for knives, a bow fashioned from ash wood, even simple toys, little animals, which he lined neatly on a shelf. At first, she thought them idle work, but one evening she asked, "Why carve these?" He tapped his chest, then pointed to the figures. "Heart," he said in broken English, "strong here." She understood. These carvings gave his spirit strength, proof that his hands could still create beauty. In return, she gave him her own kind of gift, Watching him struggle daily to move with his wooden crutches, she began fashioning something new. Using leather straps from her husband's old tack, bits of wood, and cloth padding, she created crude supports he could strap onto the stumps of his legs. They were awkward, imperfect, but when he tried them, he found he could balance more easily, freeing his hands for work. For him, it was as though she had given him back a piece of the life stolen from him. Each day brought fresh challenges, yet also small victories. Where once despair had been his constant companion, now he felt a fire within him, a will not only to live, but to shape life anew. She, too, transformed. The widow who had once moved through her days in grief now found laughter in her cabin. Again found joy in teaching and learning, found a reason to rise each morning beyond simple survival. Together, they forged a new rhythm. Work in the daylight, learning and laughter by firelight, silence that was no longer empty but full of unspoken understanding. He was no longer the warrior left to die, and she was no longer the widow abandoned to loneliness. They had become something different, something neither had expected. Two souls remade by hardship, bound together not by blood or tribe, but by the stubborn will to live. For many weeks, the cabin had felt like its own world, a pocket of peace carved out from the wilderness, far from the reach of others. But peace on the frontier was fragile, always shadowed by suspicion, rumor, and the ever-present divide between peoples who did not trust one another. It was only a matter of time before that fragile bubble was pierced. It began with whispers, on the wind. While gathering herbs near the river, the woman heard voices, the rough cadence of white settlers. She crouched low in the brush as two men rode past, their words carrying clearly in the still air. "Tracks out this way," one said. "Fresh ones. Somebody's been hunting." "Don't like it," the other muttered. "Could be Apache. Could be worse. Best tell the others." She froze, clutching her basket tightly. They had seen signs of life nearby. If they searched further, they might discover the cabin, and the man inside. To harbor an Apache especially, a wounded one, was dangerous. The settlers would brand her a traitor. At best, they would drive her out. At worst, they would kill him before her eyes and leave her to face the consequences alone. That night, as she sat across the fire from the warrior, she found herself studying him with new eyes. His broad shoulders, his strong arms, his face etched with scars of both war and survival. He looked every inch the warrior he had once been. But to the settlers, he would not be seen as a man. He would be seen only as an enemy. She tried to explain in halting words and gestures that danger was near. He understood more from her eyes than her tongue. "White men?" he asked, his accent thick. She nodded, heart pounding. His jaw tightened, and for a long time he stared into the fire. She could see the war inside him, the instinct to fight, the knowledge that without his legs he could not ride into battle as before, and the understanding that his presence endangered her. But the settlers were not the only threat. One morning, he returned from setting traps with a grave expression. In the dirt outside the cabin, clear as the print of a brand, were moccasin tracks, Apache tracks. His people had been near. Perhaps they were scouting, perhaps hunting, perhaps searching for him. He could not know. But if they discovered him, alive, being cared for by a white woman, it could be seen as shameful, or even as betrayal. The woman noticed the shadow that fell over him in the days that followed. He grew restless, sharpening his knife obsessively, his eyes scanning the tree line whenever they worked outside. The forest no longer felt like a refuge. It felt like a trap closing in. That night, she confronted him. "We can leave," she said softly, pointing west toward the mountains. He shook his head. "No." "Why not?" she asked, frustration edging her voice. He struggled with the words, then placed a hand over his chest. "Home," he said simply, pointing to the cabin. They had built together. Her throat tightened. He was right. This place, fragile though it was, had become their home. The one thing they had built together from nothing. To abandon it now would be like surrendering their bond to the fear of others. But the danger was real. Whispers of settlers searching. The tracks of Apaches nearby. The world was pressing closer, threatening to shatter the sanctuary they had carved for themselves. They sat by the fire, the silence heavy. Outside, the coyotes howled as if to remind them of the predators circling ever nearer. Inside, two souls bound by survival faced the truth. Their peace was no longer safe. Soon, they would have to choose to run, to fight, or to stand their ground together. The day of reckoning came sooner than either had hoped. It was late afternoon when the distant thunder of hooves broke the quiet of the valley. She was outside gathering wood when she heard it, her heart lurching at the sound. Dropping the bundle, she hurried back to the cabin, breathless, her eyes wide with fear. He met her at the doorway, gripping his crutches, his body tense. Though he could not ride out to meet them, he knew the rhythm of horses. These were not wild mustangs, but men approaching with purpose. His gaze darted to the rifle propped by the door, then to her face. "White men," he said in his rough English, voice low but certain. Her throat tightened. She nodded. Settlers had found them. Within minutes, dust rose in the distance, and then they appeared. 3 riders, armed and wary, their eyes scanning the cabin as they drew near. She recognized one, a man from the nearest settlement, a trader who had once spoken kindly to her when her husband was alive. Now his expression was sharp with suspicion. "What's this?" he called out, reining in his horse. "We heard talk of Indians close by, and now we find tracks leading here." His gaze swept over her, then fixed on the shadow moving just behind her shoulder. "Step aside, ma'am." Her body went rigid. She glanced back at the warrior, who stood tall on his crutches, his eyes burning with defiance. He had no intention of hiding. If they were to kill him, he would face them as a warrior, not a cripple begging for mercy. The settlers dismounted, rifles in hand. "You're harboring him," one said harshly. "Don't you know what he is? He's Apache. He'd have killed—" "Your husband burned your home if he'd had the chance." Her hands trembled, but she did not step aside. "He's not what you think," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "He's a man. He was dying. I saved him." The men exchanged dark looks. "A man? He's a savage," one spat. "And if you stand with him, maybe you're no better." Behind her, the warrior's grip on his knife tightened. He could not fight as he once had, but he would not let them drag him out like an animal. The air grew thick, heavy with the promise of violence. It was then she made her choice. She stepped fully in front of him, her body shielding his. Her voice rose, stronger than she thought possible. "If you want him, you'll have to go through me." The settlers froze, stunned. She was a widow, a woman they had once pitied, and yet here she stood between them and their enemy, with the fierceness of a mother defending her child. Her defiance unsettled them. The warrior stared at her back, his chest swelling with something he had not allowed himself to feel until this moment. Love. Not the fleeting passion of youth, not the fiery bond of battle brothers, but a love forged in survival, sacrifice, and the courage of one who saw his worth when no one else did. One of the men cursed under his breath. "She's lost her mind," he muttered. The leader spat into the dirt, eyes narrowing. "Fine, but don't come crying to us when he turns on you." With that, they mounted their horses and rode off, leaving dust and tension hanging in their wake. Only when the sound of hooves faded did she lower her shoulders, trembling. She turned to find him staring at her, his dark eyes shining with something unspoken. Slowly, painfully, he reached for her hand. Their fingers touched, rough, calloused, trembling, and no words were needed. The choice had been made. She had chosen him, and he, in his silence, chose her in return. Whatever came next, Exile, danger, or death, they would face it together, bound not by necessity, but by loyalty and a love that had taken root in the harshest soil, the dust. From the settlers' departure lingered in the air long after their horses disappeared beyond the ridge. She stood silently in the doorway, her hands trembling, while he leaned heavily on his crutches, eyes locked on the horizon. For a long moment, neither spoke. The danger had passed, but not forever. They both knew the men would return, or worse, bring others. Yet instead of despair, a strange calm washed over them. The worst had come to their doorstep, and still, they remained together, unbroken. In that defiance, something stronger than fear had been born. That night, as the fire crackled low, he spoke more than he had in many days. His English was still rough, halting, but his meaning was clear. You risked life. For me. His gaze burned into hers, filled with awe and something deeper, something fragile. She shook her head softly. No, I didn't risk it for you, alone. I risked it for us. Her words struck him like an arrow. For so long, he had thought of himself as half a man, abandoned by his people, crippled by war, left to rot. But in her eyes, he was not broken. He was partner, protector, equal. She had given him back more than life. She had given him dignity. From that night forward, they no longer thought of themselves as two people bound only by circumstance. They were something else. Something new. He began to shape a vision of their future, even within his limitations. With his strong arms, he carved and built, creating tools from bone and wood, fashioning better crutches, and even working to craft crude supports for his legs. She helped him, not as caretaker, but as companion. When she failed, he encouraged her. When he faltered, she steadied him. Each task completed was not just survival. It was proof they could make a life worth living. The cabin grew from a rough shelter into a true home. A smokehouse for drying meat. A small garden planted with her careful hands. A loom she constructed with his guidance, where she began to weave blankets for the cold months. Side by side, they transformed hardship into hope. The seasons turned, and with them, the rhythm of their lives found balance. He taught her the old songs of his people, low, haunting melodies sung by the fire. She taught him prayers from her Bible, not to convert him, but to share the words that had once given her comfort. Sometimes they prayed in silence, each to their own God, yet the act bound them closer. Danger still lingered at the edges of their world. Apache scouts were spotted in the distance once, and she saw white riders on the ridge weeks later. But neither returned to challenge them. Perhaps the wilderness itself had granted them mercy, cloaking their fragile life in shadows. Or perhaps fate had simply decided they had earned a chance. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, painting the valley in firelight, he took her hand. His voice was soft, yet steady. They left me to die. You gave me new life. My people gone. Your people gone. But we. He placed her hand over his heart. We stay. Her eyes brimmed with tears, not of sorrow, but of understanding. In him she had found not only someone to save, but someone who saved her in return. From loneliness, from despair, from the hollow ache of widowhood. And so, in the wilderness where he was once abandoned and she once wandered in grief, they forged something rare, a life built not on the past, but on the unyielding strength of love and loyalty. The Apache warrior who had been left to die, and the white woman who had risked everything to save him, stood side by side, no longer broken, no longer alone. Together they had turned loss into renewal, exile into belonging. A new life had begun.